I've mentioned, I think throughout all my 7 years, I've been going to Canada, and I've mentioned a few times in many of my lectures there, but also in other lectures for when I do debates with secularists. I always mention that one of the biggest problems in the world today is the nation-state model of government, because you have a country which represents, so they're meant to say that after the time of kingdoms, where you have like a regime controlled by a ruling family, and everyone was just a subject of the regime. It doesn't matter if they were, what ethnic group they were, what language they spoke, what religion they spoke. They were all subjects of one royal dynasty or what have you. Of course, you had Rome, you had Egypt, you had Egypt, you had obviously the Greeks, and also Islamic caliphates, right? These were ways that you had multi-ethnic, multicultural states. But in a nation-state model, the theory is that the state represents the nation. Now, the question is, whose nation, which nation? Because a nation is defined as could be defined as an ethno-linguistic group or a cultural linguistic group. And in India, despite the fact that the people in India, India, obviously there's many actually ethnic groups and many types of dialects and languages, so it's not all speaking the same language as some of the knuckle draggers from the far right in in the West would imagine. But there's Muslims, and there's a conglomerate of religions called, or kind of labeled, Hinduism after the British came there, and just we're going to call these Hindus now. And the idea of now India has to now represent a particular nationality. Okay, so which culture, which ancestry, which history does it represent? What defines the spirit of the nation? And what happens is that it forces, if you have a country that has multiple ethnic groups or linguistic groups or cultural groups or religious groups, the question now becomes, well, who will it represent? Who will determine this culture? And you'll get this kind of fight. And so what you're getting is that the dominant faction usually will start oppressing the minority. They'll accuse them of not being patriotic enough, of following a foreigner religion or a foreigner culture, or anything that's not deemed to be indigenous, quote unquote. And you see on a lesser scale, a much lesser scale in Canada, between French speakers and English speakers. I was on a plane once, actually, in Canada, going from one event, being shuttled from one event to the other during the Islam Awareness Week, and I was sitting alongside some European Canadian guy, and so I just spoke, we started talking, and he was telling me that eventually he opened up to me for some reason, and he said he supports Trump, Donald Trump, but he can't talk about it because his girlfriend hates Trump, and he actually felt very comfortable with me to talk to me and open up to me, because I just want to listen, right? I'm not gonna. I want to actually learn about why people think the way they do. And he said to me this. He said, even him, a right-wing Trump supporter, he told me that in Canada, the English speakers, English-speaking Canadians, and or the European Canadians, and the English-speaking ones and the French-speaking ones, they hate each other more than they hate migrants, right? Yeah. Migrant will be hated less than they would hate each other, and I was quite shocked by that. Like, wow, that's kind of shocking, and that's in a place like Canada, where there's plenty of space to speak whatever language in your local region or what have you. But in India, it's not language, because there's many. It's basically culture and religion. And the idea that Hinduism represents the true indigenous culture of the people, and Islam is a foreign culture, and so Muslims are being targeted. And whenever you have, problems like pandemics or even economic problems, like you saw during, fascist Europe during the time of 1890s to 1940s. Actually, a lot of countries turned fascist, not just Germany. It was blamed on Jews. And in India, economic problems, there's now pandemic, even though the pandemic wasn't started by Muslims, although I'm personally surprised that there's no right-wing media outlet out there that's saying that Muslim Chinese people started it. I'm surprised there hasn't been an article. There might already be an article. But they need to connect it to this minority that they hate, that they fear, that they want to control, they have to connect to get that, to perpetuate that hatred, the momentum of the hatred going to it reaches a critical mass in that society. And you saw that with what happened with how Europeans, not just Germans, but how many Europeans approached Jews. And you're now seeing it in India, even though Muslims in India are ethnically the same in their different regions as their fellow, neighbors. They speak the same language. For the most part, their culture is very similar. Apart from obviously the religious differences, but they're still being treated as outsiders, as usurpers, even though their ancestors are indigenous.
Do I feel that the New York police are providing enough protection, or do I have to have protection of my own? I look for protection from Allah.